Computer. Hello everyone. So yeah, obviously everyone's been listening to me natter on, but welcome to Code Harbour. Hey. It's really weird when there's not everyone around to hear me do that. But yeah, so we're gonna, obviously events recorded, so if you don't want to be on, just mute, turn your camera off. Obviously if everyone could keep their mics off unless you're speaking, that'd be really useful. And then at the end there's going to be a Q&A. Either feel free to just shout out, or you can message in the chat and I will see, and I will ask for you. So let's kick off. So first of all, we've got Ian Westbrook and a brief overview of the history and practice of user experience. So okay. Away you go.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and let me do the slideshow thing. So yeah, hello everybody. It's really good to be here, and Alex, thank you for asking me, and how the world has changed since I was meant to give this talk back in March. Lots and lots of things have changed, but you could argue that with everybody being at home in lockdown and spending more time looking at interfaces of one form or another, you could argue that user experience is more important than ever. That's my kind of segue into this. Do you see what I did there? So this is a brief overview of the history and practice of user experience. It's a radically cut down version of a training course that I was asked to give at a marketing agency in Canterbury back in February, which went very well. And so I've worked it up into a kind of bigger piece, and I'm working on some subsequent training courses as well about various aspects of UX, so UX design, UX research, information architecture, UX and agile. I haven't written all of those yet. I'm in the process of writing them at the moment. So if anyone's interested in any of that, talk to me afterwards. My name is Ian Westbrook. I'm director and lead UX consultant of a company called Future Dream Media. And we specialize, as you might have gathered, in UX consultancy, UX training, and product modeling through prototyping. So whether it's a software or whether it's a website, trying to model what it's going to be like before you actually get into code and start spending serious money. So while you might be interested in what I have to say, I've been online since 1994, and I've been working in what used to be called the new media industry, but is now just boring old IT, since 1995. And I've been in specifically UX roles, mostly UX design, some UX research, and more recently service design, since 2004. And in that time, I've worked for many companies, as you can see, RBS, Refinitiv. I spent nearly 2 years at the BMA and the BMJ, 18 months helping to redesign the B&Q website, 6 months at John Lewis, 6 months at Countrywide. You get the idea. I've been around. That doesn't mean I know everything. I'm still learning stuff every day, but I've seen lots and lots of projects. I've seen UX done very well. I've seen it done not so well. So hopefully I've got some perspective. Let me just shrink that down. So what is experience design? So often a good idea to start with a quote from Steve Jobs. So design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. So if you think about an iPhone or an iPad, it's not just the feel of it in your hand. It's not just that bevel that Johnny Ive sweated blood over, but obviously it's how it works as well. In short, it's the experience. What's the experience like? And of course, the experience can start way before you actually have the product in your hands, and it can continue way after you no longer use the product. So thinking about Apple, well, Apple's a bit ubiquitous, but think about any brand. You have an initial contact with that brand. It could be marketing, advertising, above the line, TV, whatever it might be. That encourages you to engage. You might then buy the product or do further research. You then get the product in your hand, you unbox it. What's the onboarding experience like? If you think about a smartphone, do you have to sign into an account? How many screens are there? So it's much more than just the thing in your hand. How big is it? What's the bevel like? All of that. It's how it works. It's the experience. And experience design is the practice of designing products, services, media, information, and interactions for humans. So a very narrow field then. It's an extremely broad field that takes into account ideas, emotions, culture, language, aesthetics, and anything else that influences human experience. Now, clearly, depending on what the experience is, the inputs to that can be very, very different. You could argue that architects are experience designers. They create spaces, you move through them. You could argue that novelists are interface designers. When you read something on a page, it's an interface to what's going on inside the mind of the person that wrote it. And user-centered design is an iterative design process. That's an important point, iterative, in which designers focus on the users and their needs in each entered phase of the design process. So user experience is about the end-to-end experience. It can be at a micro level, so a particular interaction on a page, or the way an app works, or the way an operating system works, or the entire end-to-end life cycle for users' engagement with the product. So it can be macro or micro, and then you take that learning and you try and, oh, what's going on here? Yeah. So to put it another way, user experience is an attempt to analyze and understand users' end-to-end engagement with a product or service across all touch points, from initial contact to the end of the engagement life cycle. That can be hours, days, weeks, months, years. I mean, for example, you know, I've only ever had a bank account with one bank. So my experience with NatWest, which overall hasn't been a great one, but that started when I was 18 and it's still ongoing now. I'm 55. So, you know, that's all part, I would argue, of the user experience. And user-centered design is an attempt to take that understanding of the user experience and to design an experience for a particular user or group of users, which enables and optimizes their engagement. So this is an example from B&Q. I did this back in, or as part of the team that did this, I won't claim all credit for it, back in 2012, 2013. So we created personas and we tried to model their experience with the website that was being redesigned. So an important point about UX is about trying to do as much thinking up front before you get into code and before you get into tech. We'll come onto a screen later on about the impact of UX across the life cycle of a project. But really, it's a journey. UX is a journey from ignorance to certainty or knowledge. You start off not knowing much about the users, about their behaviors, about their needs, about their pain points, about what opportunities you have to give them a good experience. And through using the UX toolbox, so personas, user mapping, questionnaires, surveys, whatever you're finding out about the user, it's an attempt to try and understand who the users are, and how you can give them a good experience. In this particular case, this is Christine, who's redesigning her kitchen. And you can see the touch points down the side. So desktop, laptop, tablet, smartphone, contact center, or in store. And obviously those swim lanes will vary depending on what the project is. And then the steps of her journey. So you can see the engagement at various points, their user requirements, and then at the bottom you can see there are various metrics. So help and advice, accessibility, how susceptible she is to new brands, how important value is to her, and how important sustainability is to her at various points. And these days, I guess that would be called service design. I mean, I've done a lot of journey mapping, which has been called UX, and I've done very similar things which have been called service design. I kind of suspect that service design was a phrase invented by large London agencies so they could charge more for it. But anyway, whatever it's called, it's trying to understand the user's experience, the life cycle across all touch points. So why does it matter? I should say, by the way, that I've got no idea of how much understanding people on this call have about user experience. So some of you might think I'm trying to teach you to suck eggs. That's not my intention. Hopefully for others, some of this at least is new and exciting. So this is Jakob Nielsen, who's one of the godfathers of UX. He's been around forever, perhaps not as all-come-on as he once was, but still, I think, a great guy. And on the web, usability is a necessary condition for survival. If a website is difficult to use, people leave. If the homepage fails to clearly state what a company offers and what users can do on the site, people leave. If users get lost on a website, they leave. If a website's information is hard to read or doesn't answer users' key questions, they leave. Do you notice a pattern here? So, you know, I don't know how many websites there are, but I'm guessing there are hundreds of millions, if not low billions of websites. Certainly there are tens of billions of web pages. If you go to a site and it's difficult to use, you bail, you go to another site. You know, more sites are only a Google search away. And on that note, incidentally, nobody ever got confused about what to do on the Google homepage, right? I mean, there's a search box and there's a button. You put something in the box, you click the button. And I've added a few more services since then, but essentially it is still as simple as that. Very good UX, very simple, almost impossible, I would suggest, to not know what to do on that site. Well, to put it another way, you can fail in design or you can fail in the marketplace, your choice. I can't remember who said that, but I heard it once and it stuck. Maybe it was no one famous, maybe it was just someone at a conference or something. But that really stuck. You know, again, the point is, there's two ways of finding out what works and what doesn't, whether your navigation is intuitive, whether your content areas have got the correct labels, whether what's on the buttons makes sense to the users, whether the buttons are positioned in the right places on the page to actually grab the user's attention, whether the buttons are the right size or the right color, or whether having a drop shadow makes them more or less noticeable to the user. There's two ways you can figure out. You can model it before you build it and launch it, or you can build it and launch it and find out then. And I would suggest it's better, cheaper, easier to find out in design than when you actually launch it. And this assumes, by the way, that you will fail, because certainly in my experience, I've been in UX now for 16 years and I've been online for 25 years. I was an HTML author before I got into UX. And in my experience, it's very rare to get stuff right first time. And again, indeed, you come up with a design hypothesis, you find some users, you test it, you validate it. It's very rare for something to be 100% right first time. It might be 50%, 60%, 70%, but in my experience, it's very rare that something can't be improved on. And that is the idea. It's an iterative design process. So in essence, the experience design process is about removing opinion and replacing it with fact. People in HCI circles, human-computer interaction circles, of which one is on this call, my colleague Sarah, they have a phrase called naive intuition fallacy. And that is usually a way of describing the behavior of senior managers. I'm a senior manager because I've achieved the senior position in the company, therefore I have an intuition that I must be right. It's pretty much how that runs. Or another way of putting it, some of you may have heard the phrase HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion. And really it is just an opinion. So, as a UX designer or a UX consultant, I might have an opinion about what works. A manager or someone else on the team might have another opinion. The project lead or the program director might yet have another opinion. You can have 20 years experience in the field, but at the end of the day, it is still just an opinion. It might be an opinion informed by experience and wide reading and study and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it is still an opinion. How do you remove the opinion and replace it with fact? Well, you talk to real customers and users of a website or service, or if the website or service doesn't exist yet, you talk to customers of similar services, similar websites, or people that might want to use such a service. You model their characteristics and behaviors through persona creation. And then, as we've just seen with the B&Q example, you create personas and then you map their journey through what is, after all, a virtual information space. I mean, there's an infinite number of ways you can arrange a website if there's lots of pages on it. What's the right way? You model it through site maps, through user journey mapping. So you think about how those personas might interact with the website, because it is just what did Gibson call cyberspace? He called it consensual hallucination. So essentially it is just that. It's, there's no right or wrong way of arranging it. It's what's the right way for your purpose. And then you validate that hypothesis. So you come up with a design hypothesis that, based on our understanding, based on in-depth interviews with users, based on questionnaires, based on surveys, based on all the information we have, feedback from contact centers, whatever we've got, we come up with the hypothesis that this is how the website or piece of software might work. Those two phrases are interchangeable, by the way. If I say website, I mean software and vice versa. You validate it. So you might create a sketch on a page. You might create a low fidelity prototype. You might create a very high fidelity prototype. We used a lot of very high fidelity prototypes at B&Q. We had 4 very good visual designers, and we would create in Axia high fidelity prototypes that are in look and feel virtually indistinguishable from a real website, except they're obviously not fully functional. And we would use those to test with real users. And then we would iterate based on the results. So don't be afraid to be proven wrong. This isn't about right and wrong. This is about getting to a correct solution. And with this process, it is possible to make design decisions based not on opinion, but based on data and observation. You might, and I have in the past, got into heated discussions with senior managers about what's right and what's wrong. But if you actually play a piece of video captured in a usability session with a real user where, they're failing to spot a button that we think is obvious, or they get confused about where they should go in a site because the navigation isn't clearly labeled, or they can't find the important piece of information because it's buried at the bottom of a page rather than somewhere near the top of a page, which is where important information on a page should live, then really it's irrefutable. They might have their opinion, you might have your opinion. And if you have half a dozen such videos, and if you can prove or demonstrate or show that it's a consistent pattern of behavior that people aren't finding that button or not finding that content or not able to navigate, then it's pretty irrefutable. It's not an exact science. But successful digital experiences almost always have things in common. So usefulness, we'll come on to that again in a second. Something needs to be useful, otherwise, as the name suggests, people won't use it. Usability, which is around ease of use and to encourage exploration and allow people to recover from mistakes they might make, not easily destroying important information without giving warnings that that's what you're about to do, that kind of stuff. Some of you might be familiar with Jacob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics, all of that stuff. Recognition, not recall, ability to recover from mistakes and so on. Appealing, so aesthetically attractive and uncluttered. I saw it's an old statistic now, but I once saw a statistic that people make up their minds about a website in 50 milliseconds, so a 20th of a second. That can only be based on visual design. I mean, you can't hope to have read any copy or have processed any real cognitive information in a 20th of a second. If that statistic is true, and it was on the BBC, so I guess it must be true, then it can only be based on how the page looks on initial, that first instant it comes up, how it looks, and it must be engaging. So if it's not a positive, people talk about delight, creating delightful user experiences, and that's a great ideal. But even if it's not delightful, it shouldn't be painful to use. I've been selling a lot of stuff on eBay. My preferred interface for eBay is I use my laptop, so it's a web interface, and it is horrible. I mean, it's really, really painful, horrible journeys, unintuitive landing pages. I gather their app is very good, but for the poor suckers like me that use their web interface, it's not great. So if you can't make it delightful, at least don't make it painful. And this is quite an old diagram. This is from 2000 by a guy called Jesse James Garrett, and that is his real name. I think his parents must have loved Westerns. And this is the elements of user experience. There's a lot to take in, but the important part for our purposes is this bit right at the bottom. So user needs and site objectives. And you would observe that they are very roughly equal. And then, you have those user needs, you have the site objectives, and then you do functional specifications, content, design, and eventually you bubble up to the top of what somebody actually sees when they load up a piece of software or access a website. But right at the bottom are user needs and site objectives. And they are, and they should be, roughly equal. Because if user needs override site objectives, and for site objectives, you can really read business objectives. So a business wanting ROI on its investment, return on investment. If a user needs overwhelms the site objectives, then the company doesn't usually get ROI on the project. If the site objectives overwhelm the user needs, i.e. give us everything before we give you anything, you have to register before you can do anything, users will just go to another site because there's no shortage of, in most cases, there's no shortage of other sites. So you need to balance, you need to synthesize user needs and site objectives. And it is a dance, the user has come to the site for a particular purpose, whether it's to buy something or pay a bill or consume information or find a date or whatever it might be. They want something, and it's not unreasonable for the site in return to ask for something. And obviously what they ask for is dependent upon that interaction, upon whatever the cause is, the need is that the user went there. So there's a give and take. And when one overwhelms the other, you tend to get problems. In my experience of large companies, it's very common for them to succumb to what I call bubble syndrome. They can't kind of think outside the corporate bubble that they live in. So to them, of course, it's perfectly natural that and this is very true in marketing departments especially, it's perfectly natural that you should get as much information out of the user as you can, as early as you can, in case they leave. And they forget that often that makes a really horrible experience for the user, where the user is being asked for loads of information up front before they've seen any value in doing it. When a classic example of this is, you might remember 10 or 15 years ago, it was quite common to have to register before you checked out. That's relatively uncommon now. The way it works now is you check out as guest, or however they describe it. You go through, they gather all that information they need from you as you're going through checkout. So your address, if they're shipping to you, but more usually email address, often telephone number. And then usually on the last page, they say, would you like to create an account? We've got all the information we need. Just choose the password, confirm the password, agree to our marketing and T's and C's, cut the check boxes, submit, and you're done. That's a much more elegant, intuitive way of doing it. Because if you put the login, I think the number 2 reason for basket abandonment is having to create an account. Number 1 reason is shipping charges being higher than people expected. And you know, if you ask too much from people before you give something of value in return, they will leave and they may not come back. So another way of putting it is the iceberg model. So, you know, famously only a tenth of an iceberg shows above the sea. And the blue bit at the top, sort of website or piece of software, that's what people see and interact with. And underneath the water is everything that went into it, the research, the analysis, the design, the testing, the competitor analysis, all of that stuff, which should be done before the people see the bit above the water. So we've spoken about personas, about trying to model. Personas, by the way, were invented by Alan Cooper in his book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, and he describes them as hypothetical archetypes. They're hypothetical because they're not real people, they don't actually exist, but they're archetypes because they represent groups of people. And he recommends, and I think Jakob Nielsen recommends as well, that you don't typically have more than kind of 5 to 7 personas. If you have, I think the phrase is, if you design for everybody, you're designing for nobody. So the point of personas is to pick your most important customer types. So typically someone doing a browse to buy journey, someone doing a checkout journey, someone doing a my account journey, and various others, and then model what the experience is like for those users. So keep in mind at all time, who are the users? What are they trying to achieve at this stage of their journey? Their needs might change throughout a journey, particularly about content. So if you think about checkout, or you think about buying insurance online, or you know, you can come up with many other journeys, the information they need at each stage is specific to that page they're on, or that part of their journey. And what do they need to support that task? Is it copy? Is it images? Is it a call to action to have a text chat with somebody, a support person, or is it a piece of video? What is it? It's not an exact science. I mean, I wouldn't, despite the fact I've done it for a long time, and in fact, probably because I've done it for a long time, I know it's not an exact science. But thinking about this is an investment, not a cost. Again, if we think you've got a straight choice, you try and think about how it's going to work, who's going to use it, and how they're going to use it before you launch it or after you launch it. If you launch it and you find that it doesn't work the way you think it works, or the users don't agree with your view of how it should work, that can be a very costly investment, because you need to go back and recode, possibly retweet databases, maybe remarket, rebrand, whatever it might be. It's not cheap. If you can do all of that up front, yes, an investment, I'm not denying it. And how big the investment is can depend on the projects and budgets, but it's money worth spending, I would think. And again, another quote from, I think it is either Jakob Nielsen or Don Norman. Ease of use doesn't come from wishful thinking. It comes from conducting systematic usability engineering activities throughout the project lifecycle. This is real work and costs real money, though not as much as some people fear. And obviously how much it costs depends upon when you're doing it. So I like this. This is a little infographic I came across a long time ago, and I've kept it in a folder on my desktop ever since. So if we skip to the bottom right, so that's what the customer actually needed, and then all of the other frames are the way that various stakeholders or people engaged in it actually described it. So how the customer explained it. Customers don't always know what they want. How the project leader understood it. The one at the right of the top row is one of my favorites. How the business consultant described it. Of course, any consultant is always going to describe everything as wonderful. It will do everything. It will make your tea for you. It will fill out your tax return. How the project was documented. I mean, obviously in days of Agile, you should be documentation light, but someone somewhere needs to understand how it works in case everyone on the project dies in a plane crash and someone else has to pick it up, or someone comes back to it years later. So yeah, so there are always, and again, you know, this is just opinions, right? So how the customer explain it, that's just their opinion of what they need or how it should work, how the business consultant described it. And only by conducting in-depth interviews, whatever it might be, do you actually find out what the customer actually needs. Running workshops, that's a good one for extracting requirements. You need to understand the user needs, their pain points, the opportunities you have for them. So important point, clients don't always know what they need. They usually know what they want. You know, there's an REM lyric in there somewhere, what we want and what we need has been confused. They might think they know what they want, but that might not be what they actually need. And unless a client's view is based on hard data, again, it is just an opinion. You know, you might have someone that's been running a business for 20 years. You know, their view of how their business actually works in the modern world might be 20 years out of date, unless they've got hard data. It might just be an opinion. Might be based on old ideas or just plain wrong. And it needs to be validated or challenged, just like any other opinion. and that's why we do this. So UX activities have the greatest impact near the beginning of a project, but importantly continue to have an impact throughout the project lifecycle. So we talk about longitudinal engagement. So longitudinal engagement is throughout the lifecycle of a project. So it can start right at the beginning. So here you'll see on the graph that the orange line, which is UX, starts before the blue line kicks off. So there's often a sprint 0, which is a sprint or longer. I mean, I've worked on projects that have had 3 or even 6 month discovery phases where you go in right at the beginning, 3 or 6 months or a period of time before dev is due to start. And you do a deep dive. You understand the business, you understand the sector, you look at competitors, you identify people that might get involved in usability testing, how you're going to do it, where you're going to do it. In short, you really ramp up the UX effort and you create personas and you do some hypothetical modeling of their journeys to a virtual information space. You look at all the content on the site, you do card sorts, you do tree tests, you create site maps, you work out for a particular persona on a particular journey, which nodes on the site map they hit, such that ideally they should never be dead-ended, i.e. they reach the end of a process and don't know where to go next or what to do next. You do all of that stuff up front and then you start building. But in the real world, you don't always have time to do all of that. So in an agile environment, more usually you have sprint 0, which is a couple of weeks just to bootstrap yourself and understand the important stuff you need to understand. Usually that's around persona design. Usually that's around prioritizing user stories and what you're going to do first, working with the scrum master, the product owner, whoever it might be. And you'll see that the orange line declines over time. That's because as the dev effort ramps up and as people actually start writing code, obviously your ability to impact that declines. It never declines to 0. I mean, UX always, it's never too late to have an insight from talking to a user that you'd never got before. That's happened to me many times. It's never too late. You keep talking again, longitude engagement, you keep talking throughout the life cycle of the project. You validate early, you validate often throughout the entire life. So if you can, I mean, again, I'm describing an ideal world. Budgets obviously impact, timescales impact, all of that stuff. But in an ideal world, you would come up with a body of customers, potential customers, real or actual, or potential, who have agreed to help you throughout the project, and you would check back with them. Does this make sense? I worked on one project for the NHS where we had a design review group, which is 400 specialist users. It was for issuing and managing security clearance cards in the NHS, so to get access to buildings and computer systems. When you go to your GP, the person on reception will have one of these cards to give them access to the computer systems. And we had the DRG, Design Review Group, which was 400 registration admins, and obviously we didn't talk to all of them all the time, but we spoke to a dozen at any given time. We would send out a link to a prototype, they would take a look at it, tell us what they thought throughout the life cycle of the project. And the impact of UX never declines to nothing. So a high-level view of a user-centered design process. So on the left are the inputs, so business requirements, client workshops, again, thinking back to that Jesse James Garrett, user needs, site objectives, which we can read business objectives, in-depth customer or user interviews, workshops, user-centered design and sector best practice, competitor analysis, customer feedback from help desks or consumer emails or surveys or questionnaires, whatever it might be. A view from the marketing people or the content people about the kind of content that needs to be on the site. And there may well be a lot of other stuff. I don't claim that's an exhaustive list. And then you go through the process and you come out with things like sitemap design, which defines the shape of the virtual information space. So what are the content areas, what are they called, what lives in each one, how do they correlate? So again, that you don't want to dead end users. So if they finish a journey on one page in one column, is there perhaps a related link that takes them to another page in another column? Persona design, so creating hypothetical archetypes. What attributes and behaviors do they have? What tasks they need to accomplish? Every persona should have one or more tasks they need to accomplish. What barriers might they encounter and what functionality or content they need to overcome those barriers? So user journey flows, again, we've spoken about this before, how the personas move through that sitemap, through that virtual information space. Sometimes process flows as well. If it's a back-end system that doesn't actually impact users, but you need to understand how data shuffles around between systems or between databases or wherever it needs to go. And there may well be many other documents, so non-functional requirements, content matrices, and all the rest of it. So again, regardless of what you're actually doing, it's important to remember two things. Context is king. So the user's context, who they are, their relevant personal characteristics, so age, ability, technographics, whether they're good with computers and technology or not, the task and objectives they need to perform, their environment, not usually a factor, but in some circumstances, industrial settings, it can, noise, light, ambient noise, all that kind of stuff, the form factor of the device they're using, although of course in responsive design means it should work on all form factors, but perhaps in some environments one form factor is more important than others, and any other context. I worked on a project for the BMJ where we were redesigning the login, and we learned from talking to users, and it's just what we did because we wouldn't have learned any other way, that as well as the usual forgotten password link, which if you obviously forget your password, many junior doctors also forget which email they used to register with because they rotate between a health trust every 6 months. So they've got a new email address every 6 months, plus they've got their own personal email address, so a Gmail or a Hotmail, plus they've got their nhs.net email address. So we had to create a system whereby they could recover their email address to identify themselves with their BMA number or their NHS number. No one knows their BMA number, they all know their NHS number, and then answering some questions so they could identify themselves there and then, recover their email or change it to a new email, and then use that email to recover their password if they'd forgotten that as well. So highly specific to the context of those junior doctors, and we would not have known that if we hadn't gone out and spoken to them at length at various hospitals around the country. And as I said earlier, validate early, validate often. This isn't about ego, this isn't about being right, this is about getting to the right conclusion. So if you're wrong, fine, bin it, start again, take what's good and build on it, get rid of what doesn't work. And you validate with the users or the potential users of the system. And that's it really. I'm not sure how long I've spoken for. Alex, am I about on time?
Not quite.
Too short?
Okay.
Too short?
No, you've got. It's 1:45 now, so.
Oh, okay.
It's a bit over, but on it, like I said before, there's no rush.
Okay.
So
I'm done. So this is a cut down version of our one-day training course, the what, why, and how of UX. On the course, you'd learn a lot more about persona design, site maps, card sorts, journey mapping, the UX toolbox, the UX C words, so context and constraints, and a little case study about a $300 million button, which wasn't one of my projects, but it is a very fun little case study. So if you're interested, contact me for more details or talk to Alex and she can put you in touch with me. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. I hope that was interesting.
Yes, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Don't forget you can write them in the chat as well if you don't want to.
Oh yeah, I should have done that. So really brilliant presentation, Ian. I really enjoyed that. So what, with all your experience in doing this, what would you say is the one thing that you see people consistently doing wrong, when it comes to user experience or user design?
Paying lip service to it, but not actually doing it. Again, I spoke earlier about the bubble syndrome. So we work for, Megacore. And we know how Megacore works, and Megacore's interests are much more important than any other interests. And again, you find this very common in marketing departments of Megacore. And so we'll pay service to UX. So for example, under legislation, those opt-in, opt-out buttons for marketing preferences, they should be unchecked and you should have to opt in. But it's remarkably common still, despite people know it's breaking the law, to have that box checked and you have to opt out. That's just one example. They know it's bad UX. They know it's actually illegal. They don't care. They want to get your information so they can market to you. That's just one example. And I would say that is probably the most common. And following on from that is obviously if you're only paying lip service, you don't properly resource going out and engaging with real users, potential users. That feeds through to not wanting to properly fund creating prototypes, going to do usability testing. That feeds into not properly funding programs to actually recruit users to do the usability testing. So yeah, again, you see it a lot, or I've seen it a lot in senior management. Again, the naive intuition fallacy, the hippo, I'm a senior manager, therefore I'm right. Therefore, we don't need to do this UX thing. We'll say we do, but we don't. A bit like accessibility, right? I mean, all companies pay lip service to having accessible websites. How many actually do it well? Not many. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, anyone else? No. Okay, well, in that case, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Okay, so we've gone, so yeah, we're over by 5. So we're going to break for 15 minutes. So we'll be back on at 8:05 with Ricardo, who's going to be talking to us about chaos engineering, why we should all practice breaking things on purpose.
Fantastic. Look forward to it.
All right, so in a bit.